Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for January 17th, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Welcome. Joining us on the program today, we have Jim Clausing and John Hgoboom. Thanks, guys, for joining us today, and I'm Brian Rexroad. Jim, I think you had some discussion last week about some Java zero-day exploits that were being exercised, and understand you have some updates on that?
Yeah, last 2 weeks ago, I think we talked about the Internet Explorer zero-day that was out there to fix it, and last week we talked about the Java zero-day, and in both cases I figured it was going to be February before the vendors actually patched them, and I was pleasantly surprised when both of them issued out-of-cycle patches. The Java update came on Sunday, and the Internet Explorer update came on Monday, I think, or maybe it was the other way around. Doesn't matter. But they both came since our last show. The one thing that I did want to mention, though, is U.S. CERT, the Department of Homeland Security folks, continue to recommend that you leave Java disabled in your browser unless you absolutely need it, because while this fixed the particular zero-day that we were seeing in the wild, there are still a number of issues there, and probably some tweaks to this past one that they expect will be exploitable here in the near future. H.D. Moore from Rapid7, the guy who initially wrote Metasploit, was quoted in one article as saying he figured it would take Oracle 2 years to fix all the problems that he thinks are there, although I'm not aware that he's pointed out to Oracle where all the problems are that he thinks are there. But anyway, it's a complex piece of software, so U.S. CERT is recommending keeping it disabled unless you absolutely need it. My friend Richard Porter over at the Internet Storm Center did a post also last week talking about how to deal with it when you can't disable it, because we talked about that some before. There are certain business critical applications, for example, that may require it. So he gave some ideas on how to, for example, filter outgoing traffic based on user agent strings so that you don't let the Java virtual machine actually make outbound internet connections, only allow them to inside your firewall to your particular business application that requires it. We've talked about using Sandboxy before to try to limit the potential damage. So I don't remember whether we talked about it last week, but it's other reports, surveys of web applications that show that the Java plugin itself isn't really necessary for most people to enjoy most of their web browsing. It's a very small amount of websites that require Java. A lot of them require JavaScript these days, right, which is an entirely different product. So anyway, I had said last week I didn't expect those to be patched until next month. As I said, I was pleasantly surprised, so I figured we ought to update our audience.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think that's a good update. So they are trying to fix these problems. I think it's kind of interesting to observe here. Maybe it's just me, but it seems like the level of aggression or the significance of or frequency of zero-day exploits seems to be on the uptick here. I think we're seeing in both Internet Explorer, Java, and it's not just one. There appear to be a number of them. Perhaps they're very related in terms of the techniques that are being used there. But ultimately, zero days just don't come out of the blue. They're things that take some investigation and research to actually create them. perhaps you can identify through fuzzing ways to crash applications that actually to make them do something in a controlled manner in a bad way. That takes a little bit more work. So it sort of indicates to me that maybe there's an increase in activity in that way. And on the good side, it sounds like the response activities, as you said, they came with out-of-band patches. So on the response side, taking it a little more seriously as well.
Yeah, I was really happy to see those.
Yeah. And I think you touched on this in a matter of speaking about controlling where Java could be used in in an enterprise environment, for example. I thought that was a good point, and that perhaps there's a way to there are certain critical applications that you might be very sensitive to, or certain types of browsing that where you might want to make sure that you're controlling things. Sandboxing is a good way to do that, perhaps. Whereas if you have any question about the site that you're visiting and the legitimacy of that, or the possibility of some kind of a drive-by type, malicious activity, to make sure you're taking some extra steps to protect yourself. So I think those are good workarounds to keep in mind as we're doing things. Certainly, if there are critical applications, I think one of the things that comes to mind are, industrial control, SCADA type things that are of a growing concern, making sure that any applications associated with those are very well locked down and not able to unnecessarily be exploited through one of these 0 days.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Good point. And, on that particular note, when we talk about SCADA, a lot of times those things are not particularly updated. So sometimes if they are dependent on Java or some other, back-end application like that, they're not usually, sometimes they require you to have an older version, I guess is what I'm saying, and they might break if you upgrade. So that's something to consider if you do have some of these SCADA systems, particularly ones that don't get patches as regularly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think, John, you kind of buried in your point there. I think is one of those important considerations in any kind of security application. Remember the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I think in a lot of the industrial control systems, a lot of control systems in general, the emphasis is on availability. So there's a lot of certification associated with doing updates, and so the patching might be a little bit behind. And in doing that, that doesn't mean that the system integrity needs to be compromised. It just means that there need to be other controls around the system to make sure that it's done in a good way. So whereas we tend to be a little critical if they don't get patched as quickly, there may be in fact some good reasons for that, and it requires some extra control around it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the defense in depth, the additional controls. If you have to use Java for this business application, make sure you've got some other additional controls there. In the SCADA case, do those devices need to be exposed to the internet? Should they be on a completely separate network kind of a thing? Mm-hmm. Yep. Additional controls.
Yeah, very good. Okay, the next thing I thought we would talk about here is there have been a few of the 2012 reports that have come out. One is Kaspersky came out with a report on their on the malicious activity that they'd seen over the last year to give us a little bit of an idea of what's been going on. McAfee, I don't think they've come out with their fourth quarter report. I think they come out with their quarterly report. There's a third quarter report, and then there's also a report that came out from Lookout. And I thought we'd just sort of emphasize the discussion on mobile malware here. And it seems like it's pretty clear from all of these organizations that the trend is clearly an upward trend in terms of malware activity. And I thought one of the really interesting points that came out, in fact, one of the things that was sort of quoted in the media, particularly from the Kaspersky report, was that they said that 99% of all mobile threats target Android devices. And so I have actually a pie chart that it was extracted from the Kaspersky Lab report. Also a similar kind of pie chart that existed in the McAfee third quarter report. And yes, clearly both of those, the majority of those certainly are pointed toward Android. And I guess the question becomes, why is that the case? I think we've had a number of discussions on this topic in the past. Clearly, we've sort of noted that the greater flexibility of the app markets associated with Android, it's a much more open design, so perhaps it's a little easier to target. And it is one of the more mainstream, so Android is getting a good market share compared to iPhone. And I think it's probably also at least as important to consider the fact that the availability of security applications on iPhone is quite a bit less. So what I mean by that is both of these reports are actually based on results or information that is collected by these companies associated with the security applications that are installed on devices. So if there is no security application installed on the device, they aren't getting telemetry from those devices. And I think there was an article that had found that just recently that pointed out that there actually aren't any antivirus applications or security applications available from the iTunes store associated with Apple devices. So I think it is probably at least fair to say that a good portion of the malware is in fact targeting Android, but I don't think that necessarily excludes iPhone from that activity. There may be a little bit of a misbalance there. In fact, I think one of the points that was actually made in the Kaspersky report was that there is in fact a significant increase in malware that's targeting Mac. And I just took a rough shot at it. It's not as if it's a huge number of different types of malware that are targeting Mac devices, but they certainly have made a significant increase. That is about a six-fold increase since 2010. So over the last 2-year period, there's been a significant increase there, and it appears to be on a trajectory certainly upward. So again, I think there's still aspects or malicious activity that aren't clearly represented here that may be somewhat due to the absence of security software that's really available for iPhone and iPad, for example. Now, along those lines, I guess we've also seen certainly cases where, again, it's these off markets or alternative markets that are sources of a lot of this malware. But another point that was in fact made in the report is that there is in fact a rise in the number of malicious programs on the official app stores as well. So these attackers are in fact trying to get around the system a little bit more, get things into the official app stores, and they might get pulled off the store relatively quickly, but they're still able to get some victims there.
Yeah, I think part of the reason why there is definitely targeting the Android more is some of the same, Microsoft versus Mac from 10 years ago kind of an issue where, the Android's the more open platform. It runs on more different types of hardware. You're not as locked in. So it's, the devices are out there for the bad guys to learn how to attack better, better able to get inside it. And just because you don't see as many attacks against the iPhone, for example, doesn't mean that the bad guys won't target it if they think there's a sufficiently large, base of users that they can successfully attack. And it's also the apps. We just got done talking about Java, and we talked last time, I got Java running on all kinds of devices, so you'll have these cross-platform things that may also, if you've got, I'm not sure if there's a Java virtual machine on the iPhone or not, or if you can install it, but, that might not show up in this kind of a statistic either if it's more of a cross-platform kind of a thing. Yeah.
Well, and I think we've talked about this before. I think we can expect to see a lot more cross-platform exploits that are going to be developed. And, Windows type devices, mobile devices, are relatively new to the market. There was a big push for those in the latter part of 2012 with the holiday season and whatnot. So I would expect that we're going to see a little more of that showing up on the radar in this coming year. So with that, I guess the one other sort of interesting point, in the Kaspersky report, they point out that it's what they call expensive SMS text messaging is still the best source of income for the mobile cyber criminals. And I think that's consistent with our observations as well, is that what many of these applications do, in addition to trying to steal information from you and maybe take advantage of that information, one of the more direct and obvious ways that they can try to get a monetary benefit from targeting mobile devices is to sign users up for a premium SMS service. That is basically a service where the charging comes back through the provider. And for some reason, I didn't quite grasp this from the report, but it sounded as if Russian users are a bigger target than perhaps in other areas. It might have to do with the way billing is done in that country. But certainly we've seen cases where that has been sort of a target in our situation, as a provider of mobile services. So I guess the advice there is to pay attention to what's going on your bill and to report any anomalies that you see as soon as possible so that it can facilitate an investigation into that.
I think we mentioned this before, but I think last time we talked about this, I said everything old is new again. Because back when everybody had modems attached to their computers, back in the early 90s, late 80s, and there was malware going around, a lot of that malware would actually wait till it was on a device, or if it was on a device with a modem, it would try to dial out to, 900 numbers or these premium numbers that would charge you a lot of money. Similar tactic, they just SMS to these premium service numbers that charge you, $3.95 or whatever for the text message, and that's how they accrue their revenue, because they have a piece of that endpoint that's receiving that money.
And it's also important to note that the malware is going to try to hide those messages, so it's going to try to intercept those. You may never see them being sent or being received, but they can still be taking place. So it's important to take a good look at the bill and make sure that those charges are in line so that, again, there's no intention of letting that sort of fraudulent activity take place, but usually the best way to detect it is to have somebody report something that they're not satisfied with so that it can be corrected. And I guess, Lookout had a similar comment in their report. They noted an increase in what they called toll fraud malware. I'm not sure we particularly agree with the definition of toll fraud in this case. Typically, toll fraud has been associated with basically stealing services. This is a case where it's actually basically an unauthorized transaction. So maybe a subtle difference there, but I think they're really referring to the same sort of thing. This is getting signed up for premium service that users hadn't really anticipated being a part of. And I guess the last piece of advice there is don't load applications that you don't really need, and that will reduce your opportunity to get exploited in that sort of way. So with that, let me pass it back over to you, Jim, and I guess yet another embedded software set of things we have to be paying attention to. Is that right?
Yeah, this was an interesting story that I came across, I guess on Monday, I think. It was Via Forensics put up a translation of an article that was originally posted in Spanish about some malware that was exploiting printers via vulnerabilities in Jetdirect. Jetdirect is initially developed by HP as a way of controlling printers, and has been since adopted by a number of other printer vendors. So, a lot of software will talk directly to the Jetdirect port rather than, the LPR port or whatever, to spool jobs to printers. And we've talked about it in the past. All the other devices that are attached to your networks that are potentially could be targets for the bad guys. In this case, these guys talked about some malware that was attempting to exploit the Jetdirect, and things that we don't always think about. We maybe encrypt sensitive documents on our PCs most of the time, but if we ever print them out to get a hard copy, they're unencrypted on the printer. Well, if you can exploit the printer, there may be copies still sitting in the memory there, or there's certainly the logs that sit there for a long period of time after the document is actually printed, which might be one reason why the criminals go after printers. So it's nothing we haven't talked about before. All these other devices that sit on our networks that we don't normally think too much about are potentially valuable targets to the bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
So this was just another reminder of that. And it was an avenue that I hadn't really thought about. I occasionally do scans looking for the web interfaces on some of these printers that are configurable over the web, but I hadn't really thought about the Jetdirect interface. So that's just another one that the bad guys thought of before I did.
Well, there are lots of bad guys out there that outnumber you, Jim.
That's true. I won't feel guilty.
Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. And I guess I thought I'd really kind of interject with a quick update here. We had been reporting over the summer and into the fall, in fact, quite a bit about the security surveillance camera DVR botnet. And this was a botnet that was basically going around identifying security surveillance cameras that were, or the DVRs associated with those that were accessible from the internet, exploiting those, turning them into a bot. And then what we observed was lots of reconnaissance activity originating from those devices over the course of the summer that sort of ended in August. But we still saw evidence that that botnet was there. Now, we also saw some indications that it was expanding to some other device types beyond that point. That went on for a short period of time, and then as of about December 18th, I don't have a graphic here for it, perhaps we'll show it in another program, but around December 18th, the command and control associated with that botnet completely disappeared. It stopped. And so we investigated that a little bit, and it appears, without getting into doing any active analysis on this, but we didn't want to be probing devices, for example. But it appears that the situation is that for some reason or somehow, the malware associated with that botnet has been eradicated from the devices. So the command and control has stopped, and basically what has happened is the things that were blocking reinfection of those devices has been released, and those devices are again potentially accessible for new exploits. So it's unfortunate that they are potentially exploitable again, but it appears that botnet has either gone dormant or completely been eradicated. So one theory is that perhaps someone that without any constraints, for example, decided to infiltrate the command and control associated with that botnet and basically told it to eradicate itself. We don't really know, or maybe even the botnet operator did that for some reason. But in any case, that botnet seems to be inactive at this point. We do have some other activities that have been taking place on the internet. The first one I'll report here, scan flows in port 10,000 TCP. Showing about 30 days of activity here, and you'll see that back this was around December 20th, there was some scanning activity on that port. It was relatively short-term, fairly aggressive, and then there have been little spikes here and there. This is not unusual for any port, for that matter. And then what we've seen over the last several days, starting around the 10th, actually the 11th of January here, are some what I refer to as somewhat regular but spiky scanning activity. So it appears that perhaps there's been some automation put around this. In doing some research on this port, I haven't found any specific applications that are associated with it. There certainly is a reasonable history going back several years of back doors associated with malware on this port. So I'm not exactly sure what the association here. Most of these probes, the recent probes over the last several days, have been associated with a single address in China. The scanning has a fixed source port of 6,000 TCP. This is a fairly typical, not just the pattern, but a port selection for a particular type of scanning activity we've typically seen in the past, looking for other open ports. And because of this sort of regular pattern that we're seeing here, there is maybe a suggestion of some automation associated with that. So we'll see how that pattern develops over time. And if you have any information or suggestions on what that port 10,000 might be, that is what they might be looking for, I'm certainly interested in your input. Next item here is actually scan flows on port, that is scan probes on port 2967 TCP. I think I reported on this a couple of weeks ago. It's associated with Symantec Systems Center. There was a vulnerability associated with this years ago. I'm thinking around 2007 timeframe. I'm showing 180 days worth of activity here because I think it's sort of illustrative of what's really going on. The activity that we're seeing here is really fairly typical. That is, there are spiky activities of probing on this port fairly regularly, not in an automated sense, but it comes and goes. There are only a few different sources that are scanning on this port. Latvia is one of the countries of origination. I don't recall Latvia showing up on the radar ever in the past, but that's one in this case. And then China also being an origination source for some of this activity. I think the three or so addresses that we're seeing, I think there's a relationship between them. They seem to be acting together, but they certainly are geographically separated a little bit. Next item here is scan flows on port 5038 TCP. Now, this happens to be a port that's associated with the asterisk voice over IP management. Associated with an application that supports voice over IP, manage that application. The scanning activity we're seeing here is very spiky. It gets somewhat aggressive from time to time, and it's really only started, I guess, really for in any significance since the beginning of this year. Again, it's not consistent. There are spikes of activity. Now, what I did notice, first of all, the source address associated with this, there's one source that's doing it. It happens to be located in Cambodia. I don't know if there's any significance associated with that. Again, I think that's the first time I've seen Cambodia show up on any of our security analysis activities. Some of the connections appear to be successful. So, for example, I had taken a look at one report on port where this it reached up around 14 million probes in an hour and saw on the order about maybe a few hundred, maybe 600 or so destinations that appeared to complete the connection. There may have been multiple sessions to a particular connection there, but there appeared to be, a number of few hundred connections that were associated with this. So they seem to be finding something and trying to do something. Either it may be password guessing activities or attempting to exploit. The motivation behind this might be to take over a VoIP PBX and be able to perform what would actually be toll fraud, that is, trying to either do premium calling or do some kind of a toll-free calling activity.
Yeah, a quick note, there was a vulnerability in the Asterisk Manager that was published last August. It gave shell access to the box. Hopefully most of the users have patched since then, but that could be one of the things they're looking for too, just a thought.
Yeah, I can imagine that there will be quite a number of these applications that don't get patched as well as they should. So it is particularly worrisome. Perhaps if we see this activity continuing, we'll give a little bit of an update on what that vulnerability was and how to patch against it. Thank you, Jim. next item here, our usual pie chart showing port probing activity over the last day or so. And there aren't really any surprises here. We do see a little bit of activity that's, we see it from time to time. This is probing activity on port 53 UDP. I think oftentimes this is looking for DNS servers that can be used in DNS amplification attacks. Most of the other activity, port 5900, port 22, 3389, 1433, port 23, all of those ports tend to be targeting password guessing activities to get access to those applications. We continue to see the peer-to-peer activity associated with the zero-access botnet as well. And then, as usual, we see port 445 showing up on this chart as a predominant player. And similarly speaking, in terms of the most sources probing, we see, again, the peer-to-peer activity for the zero-access botnet, port 23, 389 showing up on there as well. And I will point out that, in many of the previous reports, we had been only showing type 0 ICMP and really kind of bypassing that. Here we're seeing actually type 8 ICMP as well as type 3 ICMP. This is actually the way it should be. We had actually a processing bug in our system that's since been resolved, and I want to thank our team for making the fixes associated with that. So now this is more accurately representing what is actually going on. The ICMP 8 activity, this is a ping request, and basically that's used to identify active hosts, and oftentimes once they've identified an active host, will subsequently maybe do some probing on specific ports. And a lot of this ICMP3 activity can be indicative of hosts that are responding saying you can't get there from here. So a lot of this probing activity can be associated with that. And occasionally I think you can get some backscatter associated with some denial of service attacks in there. But I think it's predominantly associated with hosts that are responding, indicating that you can't get to this particular port, for example, as a result of a lot of this other probing that's taking place. That's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can reach us with email at ThreatTraq@list.att.com. We welcome your questions or comments on the program. This video program is available from the AT&T Tech channel. Just go to att.com/ThreatTraq. It's also available on YouTube as well as iTunes and audio. And thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Jim and John, for joining as well. We'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.